Good evening, everybody. We're going to get started. So glad to see you here. I thought maybe you would have been worn out over the debate last night, but glad to see you still have the energy to come out and hear some really great information from one of our best friends, Perry Dane. Anyway, thank you for your donations tonight. And I want to thank the League of Women Voters of Fair Lawn and the League of Women Voters of Northern Valley for their support as well. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time telling you about the upcoming programs because I think you might have seen the flyers on the table, and you can always go to our website and see what we're up to. And we have some great programs in the pipeline. So take a look if you're not familiar with what we're going to be doing. So I'm now going to introduce you to a dear friend of NFRPP, somebody we love having, and that's Professor Perry Dane. So let me take out my glasses so I can tell you about him. He's a professor of law at the Rutgers Law School. He's a graduate of Yale College and the Yale Law School, and was previously on the faculty of the Yale Law School. Perry Dane served as a law clerk to Associate Justice of the Supreme Court William Brennan, and his research and teaching includes constitutional law, comparative constitutionalism, religion and law, and legal pluralism. Professor Dane is a frequent speaker on church-state questions and other current issues, and we hope to get him back here on just that issue one of these days soon. He's the perfect person for tonight's issue, impeachment, this time and the next time. So help me welcome Professor Dane.
Well, thank you very much. And Rhoda is certainly right. It required a tremendous amount of engagement and fortitude to want to hear about impeachment. Is it a month now since it's been over? But I want to try to convince you that this is actually the perfect time to be thinking about impeachment, to be thinking about both its past and its potential future as an institution. So we're going to talk a little bit about this last impeachment, though that's frankly not the focus of the talk. And it's not the focus of the talk partly because that's not my inclination, but also partly because you've probably heard pundits and opinion leaders, not to mention the actual impeachment hearings themselves. So we can all be forgiven. All of us together can be forgiven if we're suffering from a bit of impeachment fatigue. So here's a question. How many of you actually watched all or most of the proceedings? Okay, well then you'll enjoy this next one. I mean, I have to admit, I didn't watch the whole thing. I knew that if I did, I'd end up in that padded room next to this guy. Years ago, when I was teaching at the Yale Law School, one of my colleagues was a comparative legal scholar by the name of Mirjam Damaška, who was from Croatia originally. And he said something very wise at one point. We were talking about impeachment, and he said, you know, the problem with you Americans, he said, is that you only think about these issues when they're right in front of you. And that's the worst time. That's the worst time to be thinking through what the institution should be trying to do, what it should look like, what its procedures should be, because you have a real case and you have real sides and a real stake. And he said, we Europeans, now he might have been exaggerating, but he said, we Europeans, we try to think ahead. If we had something like impeachment, we'd have folks, scholars, lawyers, spending time planning it out, thinking through its implications, without knowing of any specific case. He said, the problem with you Americans is you only start thinking about issues when they're on top of you, and that's the worst time to think rationally and reasonably about anything. So one thing I'm going to try to do tonight, precisely because this last impeachment is now over and done with, it's behind us, is think about this constitutional institution that we have for the next time. May it be a long ways away, but presumably at some point there will be a next time, and we should be thinking about what we want impeachment to do for us, what its purpose is, and how it fits into our constitutional scheme. So that's going to be at least part of my focus tonight, the next time. And I'm going to even suggest some fairly, not quite radical, but some fairly dramatic changes that, as a society, we might want to think about in the light of our past experience. But first some background. What is this thing, impeachment, that's in the Constitution? Well, there's no one section of the Constitution that talks in any sort of systematic way about impeachment. The discussion of impeachment is scattered. You have to put it all together. But when you put it all together, some sort of picture emerges. So the way the Constitution is structured, Article 1 is about Congress, Article 2 is about the presidency, Article 3 is about the courts, and then there are several more articles. And then there are the amendments, including the Bill of Rights. So here are all the mentions of impeachment in the Constitution. So in Article 1, which is about Congress, Section 2 is about the House of Representatives, everything about the powers of the House and who can be a member of the House and so on. And then in Section 2.5, the Constitution says that the House of Representatives shall have the sole power of impeachment. And of course, as you probably know by now, impeachment is not the same thing as removal from office, right? In common parlance, that often gets confused, right? We think of impeachment as what happens in the Senate. In fact, impeachment is not what happens in the Senate. Impeachment is what happens in the House. It's sort of like an indictment. It's the formal charge that is then presented to the Senate, and the Senate has the trial. It's a natural confusion, sort of like confusing Frankenstein and Frankenstein's monster, right? So you all know the name of the monster. The monster doesn't have a name, right? You all know that? So Frankenstein is the name of the professor who created the monster. So impeachment is sort of like that. Actually, I like that image, right? Impeachment is a monster. But in any event, it's the House of Representatives that has the sole power of impeachment, the sole power to, in a formal way, present this charge. And then the Senate has the sole power to try all impeachments. And that's a crucial word, try. It's a trial. Right? The Senate holds a trial. And when seating for that purpose, they shall be on oath or affirmation. I'm going to quote the oath in just a couple of minutes. And normally, the presiding officer in the Senate, at least a formal presiding officer, is who? Do you know who the formal presiding officer is in the Senate is ordinarily? The Vice President of the United States is the President of the Senate. Now, in practical terms, the Vice President tends not to actually sit in the chair most of the time. But in a formal sense, the Vice President is the presiding officer of the Senate, just like the Speaker is the presiding officer in the House. And in practical terms, the Vice President shows up on opening day to swear everybody in, and the Vice President also shows up because the only time the Vice President votes is when there's a tie. So if they think there's going to be a tie, they get the Vice President into his limo and he goes to the Senate. And ordinarily, the Vice President would preside at impeachment trials. As I'll discuss in a little more detail in a few minutes, it's not just the President who's subject to impeachment, it's also judges. In theory, cabinet officers, though that hasn't happened very often. So for most impeachment trials, it's the vice president who would preside, but the Constitution quite wisely says that when it's the president who's on trial, there would be something a little unseemly about the vice president presiding, right? Because after all, what happens if the president is convicted and removed from office, right? The vice president becomes president, and there would be something a little odd about the presiding officer being the person who would take the office if the president is convicted. There's a bit of a constitutional puzzle here, sort of a bit of constitutional trivia, or maybe a bit of constitutional stupidity. Who do you suppose presides if it's the vice president who's on trial? No, it's not the Speaker of the House. The Speaker of the House has nothing to do with the Senate. Nobody knows. Nobody knows. The Constitution is very clear. The Constitution is very clear that ordinarily the Vice President presides, with one exception. The one exception being the President being on trial. No mention of the Vice President being on trial. So nobody knows. Presumably they'd have to work something out. It's one of those little gaps in the Constitution. I mean, they were brilliant, but they weren't perfect. But in any event, when the president is being tried, the Chief Justice presides, and it takes a 2/3 vote to convict. And that much you already know from having watched these proceedings. So, again, the House makes the formal charge, sort of like an indictment, and then sends it off to the Senate for trial. In the section 3 of Article 1, it says, judgment in cases of impeachment shall not extend further than to removal from office and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States. So if you get convicted in a trial of impeachment, that's what happens. You get removed from office, and it's not clear if the Senate has discretion to disqualify you or not, but generally that's what happens. You're disqualified from any further office. But the party convicted shall nevertheless be liable and subject to indictment, trial, judgment, and punishment according to law. So all that the Senate can do is remove you from office, but the ordinary process of the criminal law can step in and put you on trial for whatever crime you might have committed. And then just to sort of eliminate one possible escape route, Section 2.1 in the discussion of the executive branch, the president shall have power to grant reprieves and pardons. Right? We saw President Trump just grant, 11 of these pardons. But the president's pardon power does not extend to impeachments. Right? So that's one sort of pardon that the president has no authority to grant. And then in Article 2, there's a little discussion of who's subject to impeachment. Who can be impeached? Who can be impeached? The president, the vice president, civil officers of the United States, in theory that would be cabinet members, and judges, shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. And then, just again to sort of close off one possible ambiguity, generally when there's a trial, there's a jury. In a trial before the Senate for impeachment, the Senate is the jury. There's no other jury of 12 ordinary folks. So that's this institution that the Constitution created, and we know it's awkward, right? We know it's awkward and difficult, and it's been described by a British commentator as like a 100-ton gun, which needs complex machinery to bring it into position, an enormous charge of powder to fire it, and a large mark to aim at. But in trying to understand why this weird thing was put in the Constitution, it's important to recognize the distinct challenge that the framers had. Why have this thing called impeachment? Right? Why have this thing called impeachment? Well, it arises out of the structure of American government and the structure of the American Constitution. As you probably know, governmental systems in the world tend to fall into two general categories. I mean, there are some complex compromises, like in France, but in general, there are presidential systems and there are parliamentary systems. Right? So the difference between the two is that in a presidential democracy, the citizens separately elect the leader of the executive, the head of the executive, the president, and they separately elect the legislature, which is why sometimes you can have a split government, right? You can have the president from one party, you can have the Congress dominated by another party. Today, we have a sort of semi-split government, right? We have the president who's a Republican, Senate is dominated by Republicans, the House of Representatives by Democrats. And that's perfect, that happens frequently in presidential democracies because you have these two separately elected branches of government, and they're co-equal, and they have this complex relationship with each other. And because of the way electoral politics works, it's entirely possible that you'll have one branch dominated by one party, another branch dominated by another party. And the other feature of this is that the president has a fixed term. Right? The president is elected for a term of 4 years. And unless the president resigns or is removed or, God forbid, dies, that's the term of the president. That's the term of the president. It's not subject to how popular the president happens to be at any given moment. A parliamentary democracy works very differently. In a parliamentary democracy, the executive, usually called the prime minister, is not elected directly by the people. The prime minister is the head of the majority party in the dominant house of the legislature. So in the case of the British Parliament, Boris Johnson is prime minister because his party won the parliamentary election. He wasn't on the ballot except in his own little constituency. But the party that he heads won the parliamentary election. The other feature of a parliamentary democracy is that Boris Johnson only gets to be prime minister for as long as he retains the confidence of a majority of the House of Commons. If for some reason he loses that confidence, then he stops being prime minister. And it doesn't take any terrible misdeed on his part for him to lose that office. It's simply that he's lost the confidence of the House. And again, that happens with some frequency in parliamentary systems. That's one reason that parliamentary systems tend to have more symbolic heads of state. So the Brits have their queen, and other countries have monarchs, and some countries have presidents who have no power, but who play the role of head of state because the head of state provides stability, and then the head of government is just the person occupying the office for as long as that person retains the confidence of Parliament. So why am I going through all this? Because presidential democracies have a particular challenge that parliamentary democracies have. If a prime minister behaves in some horrible way, there's a good chance that that's going to trigger a lack of confidence. And it doesn't take much for the prime minister to lose office. And the prime minister might have to call an election. Even if he or she doesn't have to call an election, simply losing the confidence of a majority of the House is the end of it. We don't have a parliamentary democracy. Our president is not supposed to be subject to the whim or the political views of the Congress. It doesn't work that way. And the president, so the president is not beholden to Congress the way a prime minister is, and the president has a fixed term, unlike a prime minister. On the other hand, there has to be some way to deal with a president who really goes off the rails. There has to be some way to deal with a president who goes off the rails. So that's why this process of impeachment was put into the Constitution. So even if you look at this photo, right, when the president appears in Congress to give his State of the Union address, it's once a year, right? It's this very formal event, and he's clearly separate from the people to whom he's speaking. The Prime Minister appears in Parliament once a week or more. He's a member of Parliament. He doesn't speak from the podium at the head of the chamber. He speaks from his seat, because he is a member of Parliament in addition to being Prime Minister. So the challenge in a presidential system is under what circumstances do we remove, and how do we remove an executive who is separately elected and separately elected to a fixed term? Now, I told you a minute ago that impeachment also works for judges. Judges are also subject to impeachment. That was actually an afterthought in the design of the system, although as it turned out, most impeachments have been for judges. Most impeachments have been for judges. There have been a couple for cabinet members. The thing about cabinet members is if a cabinet member really does something that merits that sort of response, chances are the president is simply going to remove him, doesn't require impeachment. But judges have life tenure, so ideally you need some system that's going to deal with judges. And most impeachments over the more than 2 centuries of our Constitution have actually been for judges. This is a list of all the judges, at least one Supreme Court justice who've been impeached. And you'll notice a fair number of convictions, particularly in more recent years. And most of those recent impeachments have been remarkably uncontroversial and bipartisan. What tends to happen is that if a judge clearly violates some norm, like taking a bribe, right? That's a big one. Taking a bribe, acting in a way inconsistent with the judicial office, there will often be a fairly, if not unanimous, at least close to unanimous sense that this is somebody who has to be removed. And a lot of those folks resign. A lot of those folks who get in trouble resign. If they don't resign, then the remedy of impeachment is available. And as I say, it's often not partisan, not particularly controversial, even unanimous. The use of impeachment against judges was potentially a very, very dangerous possibility. And if you look at the second row here, Samuel Chase, Supreme Court Justice, he was impeached for the, quote, arbitrary conduct of trials. What does that mean? It means they didn't like his decisions, right? Back in 1804, they didn't like his decisions. Had he been convicted, that would have created a permanent distortion in the American rule of law. Would have said that any time Congress didn't like how a judge handled his or her cases, Congress could step in and remove the judge. But the Senate in 1804 was wise enough to acquit, and that has set a precedent that has generally kept Congress from abusing its power of impeachment. Some of you might remember Gerald Ford, when he was in the House of Representatives, kept threatening to impeach William Douglas, who is sort of the radical on the Supreme Court. And Ford said, we have to get rid of this guy. And they never did. And they never even came close. So impeachment for judges has been a relatively non-political, relatively successful sort of institution. So I said a minute ago that there was this challenge that the framers had about how to come up with a system, and As I said, judges were an afterthought. They were mainly focused on what do we do with a president who's really become a danger to the country. They considered all sorts of possibilities. I'm going to come back to those at the end of the presentation. They considered all sorts of different possibilities, all sorts of different ways that they could structure a system to deal with presidents who were in some way dangerous. And frankly, what they ultimately decided was to adopt a system that they sort of half borrowed from the Brits, from the way Parliament operated. They were thinking of all sorts of more exotic systems, and then they just got lazy, and they stopped thinking about it, and they said, you know what? We have this thing called impeachment. Let's just throw that into the Constitution. So impeachment in the U.S. Constitution was very roughly based on impeachment in the British Parliament, though not exactly. And in fact, there are important differences. And there are also important differences from how British law has evolved. So the first thing to understand about impeachment in Parliament was that it was part of a long historical practice going back many, many centuries of the British Parliament exercising judicial authority. The British Parliament historically was not just a legislature. It also exercised various sorts of judicial authority. Our modern conception of separation of powers took a long time to gel. And the British Parliament historically saw itself as not just a legislative body, not just a lawmaking body, but also a court. And that goes back 1,000 years. And it's only slowly evolved into the institution that it is now. So impeachment was part of that larger practice of the British Parliament, in some contexts acting in a judicial capacity. So one notorious example is that for many centuries, the British Parliament felt empowered to issue what are called bills of attainder. A bill of attainder is a really, really nasty thing. And you can see that they used it against all sorts of folks, including the rebels in Ireland in 1656. So a bill of attainder was an act of Parliament without a trial, didn't even have a trial, declaring somebody guilty of notorious crimes and depriving that person, at the very least, of civil rights and the right to own property. And if they wanted to be really nasty, also condemning the person to death, simply by vote of the Parliament. And Parliament felt entitled to do that, again, because it saw itself as playing not just a legislative, but also a judicial role. Our Constitution specifically forbids bills of attainder. The framers specifically did not want to give Congress that authority, and to their credit, the British haven't had a bill of attainder since 1820. So in principle, it's still available, but it's one of those institutions that has simply died for lack of use. But it's an example of this larger pattern. So what about impeachment itself? Well, so before we get to impeachment itself, until about 10 years ago, the British Parliament has two houses, just like we have the House of Representatives and the Senate. They have the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Until about 10 years ago, it was a little complicated. The House of Lords was the highest appellate court in the United Kingdom, in theory. In practice, there was a bunch of judges who were appointed to the House of Lords, and they became part of what was called the Appellate Committee, and they acted as the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom. So they were technically a committee of the House of Lords, but they were the only ones who decided cases. The last time one of the other lords tried to vote in one of these cases, the presiding officer said, "Shut up." So in theory, the House of Lords was the highest court of the land. In practice, it was a group of 12 judges who sat in the House of Lords, but they were really sitting as judges. It's this sort of wonderful British way of evolving through retaining the old, the old wine bottle and putting in different wine, right? So the House of Lords, which once had actually been a court, now handed that power over to one of its committees. But interestingly enough, 10 years ago, and it was only 10 years ago, the Brits decided this really doesn't look good, and nobody understands it. We're going to create a separate Supreme Court, and that's what they did. So the United States has had a Supreme Court separate from Congress since the beginning. The Appellate Committee of the House of Lords met as a committee until about 10 years ago, and now there's a separate Supreme Court of the United Kingdom, which is actually a really fabulous institution. So this practice of Parliament acting in a quasi-judicial way has really died out over there. We took a piece of it, this impeachment idea, and we put it into our Constitution, but we changed it. We changed it. So Parliament had the authority to impeach anyone and to impose whatever penalty it chose. Right? So when Parliament impeached, it could impeach a government officer, it could impeach somebody who is not a government officer, it could impeach a private individual, and it could choose whatever penalty it wanted. So conviction after impeachment could lead to imprisonment, death, whatever they felt like. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, when we took this idea of impeachment, we restricted it. So the only thing that can happen on conviction after an impeachment trial is removal from office and disqualification from future office. Parliament could impeach anyone, and in our Constitution, impeachment is only open to certain government officials. So we took that structure and we altered it. But the whole thing, and again, just like they got rid of bills of attainder, the British Parliament hasn't had an impeachment trial since 1806. So just as we were adopting it in our Constitution, they were getting rid of it. This was Henry Dundas, the first Viscount Melville, the first Lord of the Admiralty, who was acquitted on a charge of misappropriating public funds. So impeachment, the way we have it, is this unique proceeding. It's this unique proceeding. It's a trial held in Congress. So it has many of the features of a trial, and yet without the background that made impeachment make sense in the old model that we were borrowing from. So it's the classic square peg in a round hole, and whenever you try to hammer a square peg in a round hole, you're going to get some trouble. So impeachment has never been easy. It's never been completely. We've never been able to completely make sense of it. One of the confusions about impeachment, though, and here I do have very strong views, it's often been called a, quote, political process. So some of you have heard somebody during the course of the Trump impeachment trial saying it's a political process, right? Did you hear that? Right. But what does that mean? What does that mean to say that it's political? Well, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell had a very clear view. So he said, I'm not an impartial juror. This is a political process. That's not anything judicial about it. The House made a partisan political decision to impeach. I would anticipate we will have a largely partisan outcome in the Senate. I'm not impartial about this at all. There's a problem with that, though. Not with the use of the word political. And it's a problem that lots of commentators pointed out. I'm certainly not the first. The problem is that Mitch McConnell and the rest of the 99 senators on being seated as jurors in this trial took a very specific oath. Not their ordinary senatorial oath. They took an extra oath. This is the oath that was administered to them by the Chief Justice. Do you solemnly swear that in all things appertaining to the trial of the impeachment of, in this case it was Donald Trump, President of the United States, now pending, you will do impartial justice according to the Constitution and laws to help you God? So here's McConnell saying, I'm not an impartial juror. But he swore to be an impartial juror. What he was hanging his hat on was that word political, because everyone has always known impeachment is a, quote, political process. So he said, if it's a political process, how can I be impartial? How can I be impartial? But what we need to do is figure out how it can be a political process and still be consistent with this oath. And I think part of the confusion is the meaning of the word political. This isn't like the meaning of the word is in the Clinton trial, right? This is a much deeper puzzle. What do we mean when we say that impeachment is a political process? And if you take anything away from this evening at all, it's the following 2 minutes, trying to make sense of what it means for impeachment to be a, quote, political process. Because we've really cheapened that word political, right? We've really cheapened the word political. So what does impeachment mean? I think the way McConnell understood it is that it's political versus legal, right? This isn't a legal proceeding. It's not a court of, the impeachment trial is not a court of law. It's political in the same way that everything that Congress does is political, right? Members of Congress have their biases, their views, that's fine. They have their policy preferences, they have their party loyalties, and that's how we ordinarily expect them to behave, and that's fine. And McConnell was saying, impeachment is political just like that. It's not about the law, it's about politics. It's about partisan politics. I think on that score, he just got the definition of the word wrong. Yes, impeachment is a political process, but not in that sense. It's not political versus legal. It's political in 2 other ways. One way it's political is very simple. It's political versus judicial. That is to say, it's a legal process. Impeachment is a legal process. The Senate holds a trial. It's a real-life trial, but it's not in the courts, right? It's legal, but it's not in the courts. It's this extraordinary vestige of something that the British Parliament used to do all the time, which is act as a court itself. So one way to think about it is that we actually have 2 Supreme Courts of the United States. 99.99% of the time, the Supreme Court of the United States are the 9 folks in robes who sit in the Supreme Court building at 1 First Street Northeast in Washington, D.C. But 0.1% of the time, when there's a trial of impeachment, the Supreme Court of the United States is the Senate. And for the sole purpose of figuring out what an impeachable offense is, what the procedure should be, for those limited purposes, the Senate is the Supreme Court of the United States. And the courts have accepted that and respected it. There's no appeal. There's no appeal from a Senate conviction or acquittal to the courts. There's no review in the courts. President Trump kept threatening to sue. Doesn't work that way, right? For the limited purpose of trials of impeachment, the Senate is the highest court of the country, but it's acting as a court. So it's political not in the sense that it's not legal, it's political in the sense that it's not judicial. It's not the ordinary courts, it's this extraordinary court. And then finally, it's political versus mundane. It's political versus trivial. It's political the way we use the word when we talk about political philosophy or political theory. It's political in the way that Aristotle talked about political when he wrote the Politics, right? It's political in the sense not of being partisan, but in the sense of being about the most important things that our society needs to care about. So as Hamilton put it, impeachable offenses proceed from the misconduct of public men, from the abuse or violation of some public trust. They are of a nature which may with peculiar propriety be denominated political. But political in what sense? Political because they relate chiefly to injuries done immediately to society itself. So that's what he meant by the word political. An impeachable offense has to be political, and impeachment is a political process because it deals with threats to the very structure and the very integrity and the very dignity of our government. It's political in that very elevated sense. So to go back, there's one incorrect way of understanding what political means, which was Mitch McConnell's way. Right? And there are two quite respectable ways of understanding what political means. It means that it's not in the courts, even though the Senate is acting as a court. It's not in the ordinary courts. And it's not about ordinary stuff. It's not about ordinary misdeeds. It's about the highest sorts of misdeeds. So as Chief Justice Joseph Story wrote in one of his commentaries, strictly speaking, the power partakes of a political character as it respects injuries to the society in its political character. Right? It's not. There was one Supreme Court case about impeachment where the Supreme Court said we're going to stay out of it, but they had to argue. They had to have an argument about why they would stay out of it. And one of the justices asked, could the Senate just remove somebody for anything? Could the House impeach somebody for anything? Is there any point when the ordinary courts would step in and say you're going too far? And I think it was Rehnquist who asked, well, what if somebody was accused of killing a cat, poisoning a cat? And that was his example of something that would definitely not be appropriate for an impeachment. And my first reaction when I read that, frankly, was, well, I think killing a cat is intentionally killing a cat is a pretty bad thing. I would consider that to be a serious crime. But then I realized what Rehnquist was saying was not that killing a cat was not serious. He was saying killing a cat was not an injury to society. Right? Killing a cat was not an injury to society. It's very bad for the cat, and it's very bad for the moral character of the individual who does it, but it's not political in that elevated sense of the word. So that helps us explain this notion of treason, bribery, or high crimes and misdemeanors. Remember, in the original British model, you could be impeached for anything, but in our Constitution, we limited it to treason, bribery, other high crimes and misdemeanors. The framers played around with various formulations. They finally settled on this one. That term, high crimes and misdemeanors, was used in lots of impeachments, so they were familiar with it. So what does high crimes and misdemeanors mean? It's high crimes. And that word high is related to the word political that I was just talking about. It's crimes against the state, crimes against the integrity of the state, the safety of the state, the dignity of the state. It's corruption of power. So it's not high meaning important or big or humongous. It's high meaning related to the very structure of government and society. So when President Clinton was impeached, he clearly committed crimes. Right? He clearly committed perjury. There's no question about it, and he admitted to it. The defense, which was a respectable defense, was that his perjury was entirely in the context of a private peccadillo. Right? It wasn't, quote, political in that sense that I've been emphasizing. So it's not that his crime wasn't serious. The defense was that it was serious, but not worthy of impeachment. What about that word misdemeanors? Right? What about that word misdemeanors? We tend to associate misdemeanors with parking tickets, right? They had something very different in mind. So for one thing, it's not high crimes and misdemeanors. The word high actually qualifies both crimes and misdemeanors. So it's really high crimes and high misdemeanors. The English language, like most languages, can be awfully ambiguous. And whenever you have an adjective and two nouns and a conjunction between the two nouns, it can be awfully ambiguous whether the adjective applies to one noun or both. It's just one of those perennial things, right? So if somebody says, be sure to wear your nicest shirt and pants, are you supposed to wear your nicest pants? I would think so. I would think so, because the person is not telling you, be sure to wear your nicest shirt, and by the way, you should also wear pants, right? So the word nicest must qualify both shirt and pants. Be sure to wear your nicest shirt and cufflinks. That's more ambiguous. Maybe you're supposed to wear your nicest cufflinks, or maybe you're just supposed to wear any old cufflinks, as long as you're wearing cufflinks. That's not clear at all. And then the third example, I think, it's a little ambiguous, but I think what the person is telling you is don't go sockless. You know, you're going to a nice party, so be sure to wear your best shirt and socks, right? Not necessarily your best socks. So depending on the context, these things can work out in different ways, but my assumption, which is the assumption of lots of other people, is that high crimes and misdemeanors means high crimes and high misdemeanors. And it's one of those legal doublets. I think trying to figure out the difference between crimes and misdemeanors is a silly exercise. It's really one concept, right? It's like cease and desist, null and void, last will and testament, right? Lawyers love that sort of stuff. And it's the way of madness to say there's a difference between ceasing and desisting, or something being null and something being void. And I think similarly, trying to distinguish between high crimes and misdemeanors, it's really one concept. So it's high crimes and high misdemeanors. The next point really follows from everything I've said. There's the circle of offenses against the criminal law, and then there are high crimes and misdemeanors, and they overlap. There are things that are offenses against the law which are also high crimes and misdemeanors, but they're not identical. They're not identical. Not all offenses against the criminal law are impeachable offenses. Not all impeachable offenses are offenses against the criminal law. Right? So something has to be serious enough to be impeachable. Doesn't have to be criminal in the criminal law sense. And something can be a very serious crime and still not be impeachable. And that's what people were arguing about Clinton. So again, Joseph Story said that you don't need a statute to authorize an impeachment for official misconduct. And you couldn't have such a statute because political offenses, and again, he meant political in that elevated sense, political offenses are so various and complex, so utterly incapable of being defined or classified in advance, that the task of positive legislation would be impracticable. Our law, the Senate's law of impeachment, such as it is developed over time, incrementally. Each impeachment is a lesson for the next one. There's no rule book in advance, at least with respect to the substance. So what about the Trump trial? I hope I don't disappoint you by doing this fairly quickly, but some of this is fairly obvious, particularly for those of you who are obviously engaged and who obviously watched the damn thing. Were the impeachment counts within the ballpark of what the Constitution contemplated? Sure, of course. Abuse of power, obstruction of Congress. It seems to me that there's no question that these were the sorts of offenses that a reasonable House of Representatives could bring. Should the Senate have been willing to call witnesses? Of course. It's a trial, after all, right? So Mitch McConnell had this vision that this wasn't really a trial, it wasn't really legal, it was just, right? Of course they should have called witnesses. The problem is the Senate gets to come up with its own rules. The Senate gets to come up with its own rules. Nobody can tell it what the rules should be. So with great power comes great responsibility. And the Senate probably flubbed that. But it was certainly within their authority to decide on the rules. Should the Trump, that's a typo. Maybe it's a Freudian slip, but should Trump have been convicted? This is a nonpartisan forum, so I'm not going to opine, at least in public, but you can reach your own conclusions. So what about the next time? What about the next time? Can we take this experience and think in creative ways about impeachments yet to be, or maybe some brand new process? Should we resurrect some of the ideas that the framers threw out when they were considering possibilities? Well, there's some simple things we could do. It seems to me the first simple thing we could do is that if the Senate were really responsible, they would sit down right now and come up with clear rules, including rules about how and when you called witnesses for the next time. It might be a Democrat, might be a Republican, might be a Libertarian, might be a socialist. We have no idea. It might be in 5 years, might be in 50 years. It would really help to have those rules in place and to have them written and thought about at a time when we have no idea who's going to be affected. So I know the Senate is very busy, but one thing they could do is simply sit down right now and way in advance come up with rules. And those rules should include provisions to make it easy, relatively automatic for both sides to call witnesses. It's a trial, after all. That's what we do at trials. We call witnesses. And without having any official view on whether Trump should have been convicted, I do have an official view for myself that the lack of witnesses was a travesty. And the notion that it was the House's responsibility to get all of that out of the way is also a travesty. That's not the House's job is to present a set of charges. It's the Senate's job to hold a trial. And finally, and this is totally nonpartisan, what really got me upset, and this was frankly Democrats and Republicans both. This is one of those pox on both your houses moments. Members of the House were perfectly entitled to give their views. Everybody else in the country was perfectly entitled to give their views. It seems to me the senators, until the end of the trial, should have shut up. All of them. Democrats, Republicans, none of them should have stated an opinion on whether Trump should be convicted. And again, Democrats did it. Senator Warren kept talking about how he should be removed. Bad move, particularly bad move for a law professor. I think they should have all just shut up, and I think that it would help if the Senate had a more formal norm in place that said that's what we as the senators do. We shut up. After the trial, you can say what you like. That's what jurors in real criminal trials do, right? They don't talk. Afterwards, they can talk, but not while proceedings are imminent. It also seems to me that we're very bashful about suggesting constitutional changes. I think there's no need for that. Based on past experience, we might want to think about some possible constitutional reforms. So here's one that might make some of you unhappy. Part of the problem we've had is, and this has happened a few times, it happened with, in fact, it happened with all 3 presidential impeachment trials, right? There was impeachment in the House, acquittal in the Senate, right? So President Johnson in 1866, President Clinton, and now President Trump. Same pattern. One reason is it takes a 2/3 vote in the Senate to convict. So the country goes through this whole major crisis. And the outcome, if not predictable, is at least sadly, is at least unsurprising, given that it only takes a majority vote in the House to impeach and a 2/3 vote in the Senate to convict. And one possible reform is to make impeachment harder in the House. It would still work for those judges who accept bribes, because those votes tend to be unanimous anyway. But it seems to me there's a good argument for not putting the country through this whole mishigas when the result is preordained. I also think we might seriously consider just throwing out the whole process and starting from scratch, revamping, coming up with seriously rethinking how we respond to what is a serious challenge, which is how do you remove a president who is elected to a fixed term, who's not supposed to be beholden to Congress. And again, the framers they cycled through some possible ideas and they threw them all out, and then they settled on impeachment. Maybe not the best choice. So one thing we need to do is maybe clarify the language for removal. Don't just talk about this vague thing, high crimes and misdemeanors. And maybe we should reconsider some other ways of holding an impeachment trial. There are foreign countries that have figured out ways, and again, the framers themselves were sort of thinking about various possibilities. One possibility is you hold the trial in the Supreme Court. That actually strikes me as a bad idea. That would just politicize the court. That's a bad idea. But it has the seed of a possibility, a special court of some sort, maybe. Here's what some countries do. And again, the framers thought of this idea and they dismissed it, but maybe we should think about it. Maybe we should think about a special tribunal that's some combination of senators and judges. And I suggest this because it seems to me that the presence of judges would change the character of the proceedings. The presence of senators would keep it politically accountable. The presence of judges would impress on everyone that this really is a trial. And maybe there's some sweet spot. I don't know, but it's worth considering if there's some sweet spot, some combination of, say, a group of senators elected by the Senate, a group of judges appointed by the Supreme Court, put them in a chamber together, and hold a trial with that being the jury. Just an idea. But it's worth beginning to think about some of those ideas. So stay tuned. If we're serious about it, we'll start thinking about some of these issues. But of course, as my friend Miriam Damascus said, Americans aren't serious about that sort of thing. We're not going to think about any of this until the next crisis comes along. And then I'll be the one to say, I told you so. So thanks to Rhoda and to the NFRPP. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. And thank you all. This is way above the call of duty, because you all had every right to stay home and feel just utterly exhausted by what we've been through the past few months. So I congratulate you for showing the interest to come out here. So.
Thank you. We're going to have questions. So we'll bring the mic to you. Ethan has a mic. Raise your hand.
I'm okay. And I could probably...
My question is basically this. We're a nation of laws. We're becoming hyper-partisan. And I think some dangerous precedents have been established by the non-conviction of the president. Does it seem now within presidential authority to have the precedent of stopping foreign aid unless that money is used for political purposes of bribing foreign leaders to work against opposition to president.
Thank you. I mean, it's obviously a risk. I wouldn't say that I would not say that the very fact that the president was not convicted, that by itself means that we as a country think it's okay to use the tool of aid for foreign countries as a weapon in a domestic political fight. I don't think we said that as a country. And if you think about it, someone who's acquitted in an ordinary criminal trial, what we often say is, well, there may be any number of reasons that this person was acquitted. Maybe the evidence just wasn't there. Maybe the jury was divided. It takes a lot to draw a conclusion from an acquittal in a trial that the underlying behavior is suddenly just fine. I mean, so Harvey Weinstein is his jury is out. I mean, they're deliberating. They might come back with an acquittal. Do we take that as precedent that for influential Hollywood producers to rape young women is okay? No. What we say is in this trial, under these circumstances, this jury decided that for some complicated reason, a conviction was not in order. Now, given President Trump's own personality, I think the hope of people like Susan Collins that he will have, quote, learned his lesson, I think that hope is just fantastical. But there's a difference between whether Trump learned his lesson and whether the country will suddenly adopt a view that this sort of behavior is appropriate for a president. And the optimistic part of me wants to think, no, that's not what we as a country decided. That's not what the Senate decided. In the Clinton impeachment, he didn't get the 2/3 vote to convict. Senator Arlen Specter, do you all remember how Senator Specter voted? So ordinarily in trials in the American system, you can either convict or acquit. And we got that from the English. The United Kingdom actually has two separate legal systems, very different in many ways. So there's the English system, and then there's the Scots law. And Scots law is different in all sorts of ways. And one of the ways it's different is that in Scots criminal law, the jury has a choice of 3 verdicts. There's convict, acquit, and not proven. And you can vote not, and there's no difference in effect between acquit and not proven. Just when you vote non-proven, what you're saying is, I don't feel strongly about this to acquit, but I'm certainly not going to convict. And that's how Arlen Specter voted in the Clinton trial. And I think we can reasonably read the Senate as having voted that way in the case of Trump. There were a few senators, right? There were a few senators who said, perfect phone call, perfect phone call. But I think there were more, even among those who did not vote to convict, who said, not a perfect phone call. So I wouldn't get overly pessimistic about that. But then again, maybe that's just my Pollyannish view of things.
Doesn't it seem as though it can never work? Hasn't it in each case been politicized? It depends on how many Republicans there are, how many Democrats there are, and which party the president is from.
So, a couple of answers. The first is that impeachment actually has worked very well, as I said, for judges. Those proceedings have not been politicized, except for a couple, a long time ago. But we learned our lesson with Justice Chase. Most of the judges who've been impeached and convicted and removed and disqualified have actually committed serious offenses, and the vote was not partisan. So let's put judges off to one side. What about presidents? Well, we only have a small sample, right? We only have a small sample. We've had 3 actual impeachment trials. But to be fair, you should probably get Nixon in there somewhere, because the only reason he's not counted is because he resigned before the impeachment vote. So one of the interesting things about the whole Nixon, there was a Judge Nixon who got impeached and removed, but I'm talking about President Nixon. One of the interesting things about the whole Nixon story is eventually, and actually before the House had to act, it became nonpartisan. It wasn't nonpartisan to start with, but as the evidence accumulated, that fateful moment when Barry Goldwater went to the White House and told the president, "You have to leave." That was a very, it was a sad time and a tragic time, but it was also in some ways a stirring time. So, if you add in the Nixon case, the possibility of a nonpartisan, fair proceeding looks a little better. Andrew Johnson was acquitted, even though the Republicans did have a majority. Might even have had, I'm not sure if they had 2/3. They might have had 2/3. But there was enough doubt. There was enough doubt, even among his political opponents, about whether impeachment was the proper remedy. So that leaves Clinton and Trump. So if you sort of go by the numbers, we've had a mixed bag, right? But I wouldn't. Again, maybe I'm being Pollyannish, but I wouldn't go so far as to say that it's inevitably going to be simply a partisan, a predictable count of Democrats and Republicans. And then, of course, even in the Trump case, which speech is going to be remembered 50 years from now? Well, no. I mean, Schiff was very eloquent, very powerful, but he talked for a long time. I mean, he had to talk for a long time, but he talked for a long time on many occasions. There was one 8-minute speech that people are going to think about 50 years from now, and that was Romney's. And again, whether you agree or disagree, that's not the issue. The issue is that he was able to articulate the importance of reaching his judgment without being bound to his party. And maybe it was just one person. Maybe it was just one senator. But 50 years from now, he's the one whose vote and whose speech is going to be remembered. And I think that's also a lesson worth taking out of this sad part of our history.
Some of the framers had concerns about the presidential powers being too great. And Ben Franklin had concerns and said that, well, this is fine if you have a president like George Washington, but what if somewhere down the road we elect a scoundrel? And since then, presidential powers have grown ever greater, particularly in this era when you have social media, you have cable news channels that seem to, protect one party versus another party. Are there concerns among constitutional scholars and maybe political scientists that perhaps the powers of the presidency have grown too large? And if so, I'm not sure what could be done about it.
Oh, absolutely. There's a lot of concern, but there's been a lot of concern for a very long time. There was a term that was popular 30 years ago, the imperial presidency. Right? Just a couple of things to be said about that. One is, and I just went through several weeks in my class talking about the presidency. The Constitution is awfully unclear about how much power the president is supposed to have. There's one view that, particularly in domestic affairs, the president should really be limited to executing the laws. That's what it means to have the executive power. And that we've piled all this other stuff on historically, but that's not part of the original design. So one thing that we always need to keep doing, and I'm not someone who always feels tied specifically to the quote original meaning or original intent. That's not how I think about constitutional law. But I do think that we need to always be reconsidering and rethinking and modulating and being willing to reimagine what the presidency is. So that's one part of the story. The other part of the story, though, is you're going to get an overreaching president if you have an overly lazy Congress. And I'm not talking about this Congress responding to this president. I mean, we know about that. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about Congress for 40, 50 years handing over authority without much accountability. So, for example, the president has been declaring a, quote, emergency on the southern border. And as a result of that, quote, emergency, he claims the authority to move around money, to build the wall, to keep people out, to lock people up, to do all sorts of things. He's relying on legislation that gives the president emergency authority. Now, he might be over-relying, he might be reading too much into that legislation, but there's real legislation, the National Emergencies Act, and other legislation that grants the president emergency authority. That legislation is written with a level of stupidity that is mind-boggling. Because who gets to terminate the emergency? Who gets to terminate the emergency? Well, according to the National Emergencies Act, the way to terminate an emergency is to pass what's called a joint resolution. So the House, the Senate, they each vote to terminate the emergency. Joint resolutions, though, to become legally effective, have to be signed by the president. He can veto rather than sign. Then it takes 2/3 of each house to override the veto. So the only way to terminate this emergency is to pass a new law over the president's veto. And of course the president will veto because he's the one who's declared the emergency in the first place. And it's mind-boggling that in writing this law, they didn't do something much more sensible, which would be to say, emergencies, because after all, what's an emergency? It's a temporary situation by definition, right? They could have just written into the law that emergencies automatically terminate after I don't know, 60 days, 90 days, a year, unless Congress passes a law extending them, right? In other words, put the shoe on the other foot. Would have been incredibly easy to do that. And it nothing to do with Trump. This is not about Trump, and it's not about Republicans in Congress. This is simply Congress over the years handing over power. And it's completely within Congress's authority to take that power back. And if there's a president at some point in the future who is smart enough and politically astute enough and patriotic enough to cooperate with Congress in trying to cut back on some of this excess of presidential authority, then it's doable. But it's not, it's partly the Constitution's fault, because the Constitution, in describing the powers of the president, is awfully mushy and vague and muddy. But a lot of the fault is Congress's, and it's this accumulated laziness, political laziness over the years, that has handed over these difficult decisions to the president. Presidents since 2001 have conducted military campaigns of all sorts, using as their justification the use of force resolution that was passed after 9/11, which has no sunset provision, which has no expiration date. A reasonable Congress would have said, sure, do what you need to do. Come back to us in 2 years if you want to do more. Come back to us 2 years after that if you want to do even more. That's not how they wrote the law. And that was not George W. Bush's fault. That was the fault of Congress.
Can anything that Attorney General William Barr, anything he has done to date, be considered impeachable?
So this is actually a wonderful, this whole situation with Barr. Almost every day I come into class, because I'm teaching constitutional law, and I've been teaching this stuff, and I come into class and I said, you know what? I have a telephone. I have a special line into the president's office and into the attorney general's office. And whenever I want to discuss something really interesting in class, I call them up, and they set up the situation that we can discuss. So what's so interesting about what the Attorney General has been up to is that constitutionally speaking, don't quote me on this, this is between you and me, constitutionally speaking, Trump is right. He's in charge. Strictly speaking, as far as the Constitution is concerned, Trump is right. He's in charge. And a fortiori, Barr is in charge of the Justice Department. That's all quite correct. That's the capital C Constitution. What we've lost track of is that we also have a small c Constitution, a set of traditions, conventions, and the independence of the prosecutorial function is one of those traditions. It's not something written into the Constitution, just the opposite. It's not something that a court can enforce, just the opposite. But it's a long-standing, absolutely crucial tradition. And when I say tradition, that's not to poo-poo it. This is not a tradition, like brides wearing white. It's not that sort of tradition. This is a political norm. This is a political norm. It's not a constitutional requirement, it's a political norm. There was a really silly op-ed by an otherwise very smart law professor, I think in the Washington Post, saying, what Trump is doing is constitutional with respect to the Justice Department. Of course it's constitutional, that's not the issue. The issue is whether it's right. And whether it's right and whether it respects these important traditions. So, to come back to your original question, could Barr be impeached? We're not going to do it. You know, we're just impeachment exhaustion. But in principle, could Barr be impeached? An impeachable offense doesn't have to violate the criminal law, and an impeachable offense doesn't have to violate the Constitution. It seems to me that it's enough for an impeachable offense to violate one of these powerful, long-standing, sensible traditions of our legal structure. And the independence of the prosecutorial function is one of those traditions. So my short answer is sure. In principle, this would strike me as a reasonable, you'd have to know all the facts, but in principle, this would strike me as a perfectly reasonable, impeachable offense, even though it's not criminal and it's not unconstitutional, because that's what impeachment is about. It's about threats in a more general sense to our political structure and the integrity of our system of laws. Well, thank you all. These were great questions. Thank you.
So again, thank you for coming, and I hope to see you on March 19th, I believe. We're doing a program on the census, and that's going to be a very interesting key program. So see you then.
Oh, I see you have a program coming up on ranked choice voting.
Yeah.
You better all come to that.
Yeah. That's going to be in April. Yeah.